Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and I'm talking astrology. And on this video, I'm going to use as my centerpiece the full moon in Gemini of the 19th of December. Now, in fact, there's a lot to talk about in this section of time because there is a lot going on. So let me get straight into it. The first thing I want to say about this full moon is that it is the smallest full moon of the year. And the reason being that, in fact, the sun, the Earth, are tilted as far away from the sun as we can be. So the distance is greater. So that's why the moon looks smaller. But that brings me to one of the things that I want to talk about on this video, and that is the winter solstice, the time when the sun enters Capricorn, and we create a chart from that, which is called the Capricorn ingress, and it sets in place the next 3 months. Now, I love this period of year. I love the winter solstice, and the reason is that I'm really a spring and summer baby. I really do love the warmth and the sun and the long days, and I really don't like all the short nights and the freezing cold and all of that kind of thing. But when we get to the winter solstice, I know that at that very point, the Earth is going to shift itself back towards the sun. And over the course of the next 6 months, it'll get warmer and warmer and lighter. And in a way, this idea of light and warmth, which is so important, maybe not to everybody, but certainly to me, reminds me of the name for this full moon that I used to know it by. And this was many years ago when my astrological mentor, Ingrid Lind, who was the first president of the Faculty of Astrological Studies, she was my mentor. And she always called this full moon the Christos moon. Of course, it is the full moon before Christmas, before the great Christian celebration. But what I think that it really brought to mind, this idea of this full moon, this beautiful globe in the sky, is that it is about the light. It is about the light in the dark. It's about the Christos light. So it has a lot to do with love. And again, perhaps we should think about thinking about that when we look at that full moon in the night sky. Hopefully you'll be able to see it, and you're not living in cloudy England where we don't always get to see these nice celestial phenomena. So that's one thing I want to say. So now what I also want to do is look at the Capricorn ingress chart. Now, the sun moves into Capricorn on the 21st of December. And if we look at the chart here, I can get some of my facts right. Now, what you've got here is the Capricorn ingress chart from the perspective of London. So we're looking at Great Britain. We're looking at what the next quarter has in store for us. And I think what you can notice immediately as you look at this chart, if you go to the midheaven, that's the point at which the arrow going from north to south that we can see in the chart, that's in the sign of Aquarius, and on the midheaven of that chart we have Jupiter. Now that's one of the best positions for Jupiter, whether it's in a natal chart, whether it's in a country's chart, or even in an event chart, because it bestows a lot of Jupiterian qualities to whatever it is, whether it's a person or an event, or in this case, a quarter chart, a 3-month chart. So there is some joy within this, Jupiter, Jove, joy. There is some expansion, and there is a sense of goodwill and good things going on. And we haven't heard those words, at least not on my videos, for a long time. We also, of course, have to remember that Jupiter is also inflation, and we don't really like inflation very much. And if you look at this chart, you'll see Jupiter there conjoined to the midheaven. And one of the things we think about in this area of the chart is the government. It tells us a lot about the government. So maybe the government is overreaching itself. It has overweening ambitions that are causing it to be blind to common sense and the people. Well, that wouldn't be a first time, would it? Now, the other thing about this Capricorn ingress chart from the perspective of London is if you look at that kind of 2 o'clock position, you'll see Venus and Pluto together. They're very, very closely in conjunction and opposing the moon. And this is on the 2nd 8th axis, so we're in the area of finance. So on the one hand, Venus-Pluto can mean, a major kind of influx and growth and extraordinary developments linked to money, but it can also mean great losses. And with the moon opposing Venus-Pluto conjunction and that Jupiter in the 10th house, my advice to you would be, whatever the bullish forecasts for the economy and for things that require big investment, this is probably, I won't say it's moonshine, that's not perhaps the word I want to use, but they will be over exaggerated. But the same thing we could say about real doom and gloom. The forecasts, if they are doomy and gloomy, are probably exaggerated. There's no need to quite go there. Now, the next thing I want to do, want to come back to me, is to show you how different this chart looks when we look at it from the USA's point of view. And in this occasion, we take the place of birth to be Washington, D.C. So here, let's have a look at what happens when we set the Capricorn ingress up for Washington, for the United States. Well, here you have a very different kettle of fish, don't you? I mean, we still have Jupiter in a very, very prominent place. On this occasion, we have Jupiter on the ascendant. And we can see here at 28 degrees of Aquarius, it's 2 degrees away from Pisces. And yes, in due course, as we go through December, Jupiter will enter the sign of Pisces, where it's going to move through for the next 5 months. Now, I'm going to talk about more about Jupiter and Pisces on another video. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but I do want to have a look at this idea that here we've got Jupiter on the ascendant of the American chart, or, it's set for America. And what we look at here is Jupiter's inflationary property, perhaps giving the USA an exaggerated sense of its power and importance. Maybe it feels full of largesse and will be doing, a lot of things in the public interests and in the country's interests. But there's that fine line between feeling bullish about things and, over exceeding your limits. And we have to bear that in mind with Jupiter. And again, we've got Neptune in the first house. So there is, to me, a sense that Neptune sometimes blinds you to the reality, and there could be a danger within these next 3 months, this first quarter of 2022, that there are situations which are clouded, that you can't see the reality. And so there's a sense of things being misunderstood, misrepresented, and therefore the actions taken by the government, in this case, Sun in Capricorn up in the 10th house, could be mistaken. These are going to be actions which will be regretted. Also here, remember when we looked at the chart from the perspective of London, we had that Venus-Pluto moon opposition straddling the axis of finance. Here you get Uranus in the 2nd house, which shows that the financial picture for America is fluctuating. It is not stagnant. It isn't predictable. So, as you'll see when we come to look at Venus on retrograde, this is a delicate time for economies and for investment. So let's come back to me again, and we'll get on with the next part. And I really want to get right into the full moon. In terms of, how I do it, I like to look at what that full moon is, what is the background to that full moon. And just in case you're interested, the full moon is exact at 4:37 in the morning on the 19th of December. But on the eastern seaboard of America, it'll actually be the day before. It's actually going to be the 18th at 23 hours and 37 minutes, so it's just before midnight. And if you're over in Sydney, you're far away on the opposite side of the globe, then this full moon will be on the 19th, and it's going to be sort of 3:37 in the afternoon, just in case you're interested in all of these things. This particular full moon is connected to the new moon of the 10th of June, which was a solar eclipse. So there's a beginning and an end in process. And what you might need to think about is the events that were happening to you around the 10th of June, what you were doing, what happened, especially if anything began at that point. Because we're getting closure, as we always do with full moons, closure and completion, and that is going to appear around or on the 19th of December. So these two time periods are linked. So let's have a look at this full moon in Gemini, its place in the bigger scheme of things. Now, I've set this for Cairo in Egypt, mainly because I wanted to see or be able to see the sun and moon clearly opposite each other. And in fact, they're on the horizon here. So the moon will be setting, the sun will be rising in Cairo. And here, what I want to point your attention to, you can see the sun on the left at the 9 o'clock position, the moon on the right in the 3 o'clock position. That we also have some interesting kind of developments here, because in point of fact, the Venus and Pluto will be drawing towards their conjunction at this time. And I want to talk quite a lot about Venus on this particular video. Saturday the 11th is when Venus and Pluto are exactly conjunct. They will move forward, or rather Venus will move forward, but then she's going to turn retrograde. And she's going to turn retrograde on the day of the full moon, which is very significant. And I'm going to be talking about that in a little minute. The other thing I will be talking about also on this video is the Saturn Uranus square, which I've spoken about quite a lot, but it's important in this time frame because they will meet in square for the third and last time in this particular sequence. And so we can see here Saturn at 10, almost 11 of Aquarius, and Uranus at 11 of Taurus. And so those are the degree areas we're looking at. You had anything at 11 degrees of any sign, you're going to pick up that Saturn-Uranus square. And of course, particularly if you are an Aquarian, a Leo, a Taurus, or a Scorpio, and you do have a planet, or the sun indeed, around that 11 degrees, then the impact of this Saturn-Uranus square is really, really important. Now, as I said, I've talked about this quite a lot, and one of the things I think we've all got rather used to with the Saturn-Uranus square is the idea that our freedoms are limited. We don't have freedom. We don't have the freedoms we used to have. And, you know, we're seeing this more and more, whether it comes to the actions of Facebook, or it comes to, you know, the street where we live, the CCTV cameras, you know, our movements are tracked, our cars are tracked. We've been very much aware of this during the course of this year with the various news stories that have broken that have involved quite a lot of invasion of our privacy. That has certainly been a big theme of the Saturn-Uranus square. But of course, we are moving away from the old. The old patterns must die, and that means old patterns that we're used to in ourselves, in our behaviors and in our lives, the things we used to do. They're going to be replaced by new things, as they should be. We have to grow, and even if we don't like change very much, that's what the Saturn-Uranus connection is all about. It's saying goodbye to the old and welcome to the new. But we also look at that sense of Saturn representing responsibility, our duties, the things that we are bounden to do. And often they're things we don't really like. But we don't get to be able to move forward unless we've completed a task, we have atoned for our behavior, we've done things that we've taken accountability. then we get to move forward into new directions. That's the dynamic of that Saturn-Uranus square, and is going to be particularly alive and well around the time of the full moon and exact, in fact, on Christmas Eve. So now I want to talk a little bit about Venus in retrograde, and we can come back and I'll talk to you as myself. And what I want to say about Venus in retrograde, I mean, we're all very, very used to retrograde Mercuries. They happen 3 times a year, sometimes even 4. And we know that we get snarled up in traffic. The internet highway gets jammed. We get misunderstandings, delays, frustrations with communication. We're very, very used to that. But of course, we also know the benefits of a retrograde Mercury. We get to go back in time. We get to reconsider our opinions and our views and maybe remake a plan. And sometimes by being delayed, by not going forward as we thought we would, we learn a great deal, and it is much, much better at the time we do eventually do that thing or have that thing happen. Venus is a little different, of course, because Venus is a very different planet. And when we look at Venus, we're looking at the keyword principles of this planet. We're looking at love and beauty, the arts, pleasure. We're looking at union, unity. So Venus has a lot to do with the things that make our life pleasurable. Now, we talked about Jupiter a minute ago, and I talked about the joy of Jupiter. Jupiter is known as the greater benefic in astrology, and Venus is the lesser benefic. And these 2 planets really give us our jollies in life. If it weren't for them, we'd be stuck with Mars, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and really, life might not be worth living. But when Venus goes retrograde, and also I want to point out here that it's a strange factor, but Venus is always at her brightest just before she turns retrograde. And if you live in the right place, and again, you've got the right kind of atmospheric conditions, the right weather, you should be able to see Venus rising or setting. Well, it depends where you are in the world. And here is a beautiful view of what I mean here with Venus. I mean, how beautiful is that? And rather like looking at the full moon or all those, last year when we looked at the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, it's like the reality of the planets brings something to our understanding of what they mean. And so I really am very keen on getting out and looking at the constellations and the horizon and seeing what we can spot. But yes, Venus retrograde. So always at the point that Venus turns retrograde, and she turns retrograde on the full moon day on the 19th. So we're going to go a few days before that and a few days after, because Venus will be stationary, and that means her properties are going to be really supercharged. Now, I've mentioned all the qualities of Venus, so we need to look at those sorts of things in our lives. But I think also we need to think about, finance is an important aspect of Venus as well. And I think I wanted to get to this idea that when we think about a planet moving retrograde, which of course is a phenomenon. It doesn't actually happen. It's just to do with the relative speeds of the planets. But there's always, it changes its flavor subtly. I talk about the idea of taking a piece of chicken and marinating it in different spices or herbs. I mean, you change the flavor, but it's still a chicken. And it's the same really with Venus in retrograde. She doesn't change herself, but the nuances of Venus are different. So, for instance, related to your love life and relationships, maybe you will feel there's a bit of a chill in a relationship. Maybe you feel a relationship has suffered a setback. The thing about this is to remember that Venus will, of course, turn direct, and she's going to do this at the end of January. And then she's going to move forward again and complete what we call that shadow cycle, which I'll explain in a minute. And so there's quite a lot of maneuverability in this, in consideration with judgments and situations that happen in the area of love and all relationships, because we can look at business relationships as well. It isn't always just love. And considering that Venus has a lot to do with money and finance, maybe just as important about financial relationships and relationships that involve money. That this idea that the situation, the status quo as we go through a Venus retrograde period may change. And that's as much of a benefit if you think that maybe things seem to have cooled and turned south. The idea that things can change again and get back on track, although they will be different. And the same kind of proviso that if something great and good happens, relationship-wise, it's not over till the fat lady sings. And perhaps some of the arrangements and plans you make in regard to a relationship or to your love life may be subject to change. And that's all you really need to think about. Now, I'm not a financial astrologer. I don't specialize in financial astrology. Lots of astrologers do, and it's really a fascinating branch of astrology. But what a lot of astrologers do say, if they work in the world of finance, is that there tend to be more bear markets or bear moves when Venus is retrograde. Now, it doesn't happen every single time, but it's worth bearing in mind. And, earlier on in my video, I talked about the economy in regard to England and also to the USA, and thinking about the extreme possibilities here of super inflation and problems with finance, as well as major innovation and quite a boom in terms of finance. Well, let's set this in the context of a retrograde Venus and see that maybe this is perhaps a very delicate period for the world economies, and that judgments must be subject to change. And it's down to you if you do invest money in the market, or you invest money, you save it somewhere, that the picture might change. And even if the picture changes because you change, it's a delicate kind of matter. So anyway, let us move on. And where do I want to go? I want to go to the full moon. I want to talk about where this full moon is in terms of the various signs of the zodiac. Now, I know that a lot of you really love this, which is why I do it. But I hope at the same time you're getting to see this bigger picture. And in a funny kind of way, I think all of us are astrological researchers, because we can use our own life, our own experience, and also the things that happen to our friends and family and on the world stage. And we can have a look at what signature was on that. Was it that Venus-Pluto conjunction, which is pretty powerful? So, shadow periods. I did mean to say something about the shadow period. This is for Venus. That the shadow period began on the 17th of November. And that's defined because as far as when Venus turns retrograde and gets back to a certain point, that's 11 degrees, that's the 11 degrees of Capricorn, it will move forward again until it bypasses the point at which it turned retrograde. And that's going to extend right through to about March the 3rd. So you can imagine that, there's a lot of wood to chop and a lot of water to go under the bridge in that period from the 17th of November to the 3rd of March. That's that complete Venus shadow cycle. And just as a case in point, that on the 17th, 16th, 17th of November, in regard to Venus reaching that's the beginning of the shadow cycle, one of the things that happened was that the German energy ministry, so to speak, put a stop or a hold on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which is going to extend from Russia under the Baltic all the way, to Germany, Europe. And this is extremely important, particularly to Putin, and this may well have played into all the developments around that time, around Ukraine and the fears that perhaps Russia was going to invade Ukraine. Well, my theory about this was that got stopped in its tracks because it was so important for Russia to still have access through Ukraine, because that's where their gas comes from. They couldn't actually strike until they have the Nord Stream 2 pipeline functioning. Okay, so I think that's kind of important. And we may want to look as we go through to, the March the 3rd, the twists and turns, particularly in relation to this pipeline, Russia, and the whole Europe-Ukraine connection. But anyway, let's get on to what's happening with this full moon in your case. Well, the full moon is in Gemini, which means it's in your sun sign. If you're a Gemini, it's in your first house. And it's the same as if you do have this full moon in your first house. It's very personal. This is about your image. It doesn't mean you have to change your image or anything. It just means that your image is is under the full moon, as it were. So there's something about reflecting on who you are and how you present yourself to the world. And Gemini, of course, you present yourself to the world in all sorts of different guises because you are a chameleon sign in a way. But this is more reflective. A full moon is always reflective, and remember, it's closure and completion as well. So it completes a personal cycle. You are sort of always empowered when the moon is in your sign. So in a funny kind of way, even though we think of the sun as the solar force and therefore the more powerful, and the moon as the lunar, more reflective source, I would say, Gemini, that you are quite empowered around the time of the full moon, and it would be a very good time to make some decisions related to your personal world. Now, of course, with Sagittarius, we've got the complete opposite. The sun is in your sign, so the moon is in your opposite sign, and in the 7th house, we're talking about relationships. So this is a time where I think you need to listen to other people and perhaps to bend to their needs and feelings. Now, it doesn't mean that's going to be that way forever, but it's a good time to listen carefully to what your partner is saying or to what people you are in a relationship with are saying, whether it's a business relationship, a working relationship. Listen hard. Try to engage in where they're coming from. And remember that idea of nuances that I talked about when a planet is retrograde, it brings out a different flavor or a nuance. Well, this is a time when you need to also attach that to your relationships, that there are some shadows, shades, and nuances that you need to pay attention to. And of course, with both Gemini and with Sagittarius, this is a time of completion in relationships. So maybe you are ready to tie the knot and get married. And if we go back to that June the 10th period and that solar eclipse, maybe it was at that point you made a big decision about a relationship, and now it's come to fulfillment. You're ready to, do the job. That's it. It's reached that completion. But sometimes it's the other way around. What you get instead is that events, decisions that you made around the early to middle part of June, it means that something has run out of road now. It's done its time. It was meant to last this particular amount of time, but no more. So closure means endings, really. So if we come now to Pisces, then we look at this full moon in the 4th house of home and family, your forebears, your ancestry, stretching back through the generations. And we think of the sun in the area of career, life direction. So this is a pretty important place for the full moon. And I think it means it's going to vary in texture from Pisces to Pisces, but using that theme of closure and completion, there is a sense that it's good to close things up and move on, whether we're talking about a career, whether we're talking about a particular job, whether we're talking about a place where you live. it's this idea that we need to move on. Remember, I was talking about that really with the Saturn Uranus square as well, which is happening at, at a very similar time. This idea that in order to move forward, we have to close things up. We have to put them away. We have to put our toys away before we get to eat our dinner, kind of thing. I know that's a bit silly, but the idea is that if we don't tie things up and we don't say goodbye to them, we don't put them away, we're going forward with a lot of baggage and straggly ends. And a full moon is a really good time to nip something in the bud and close it off. So yes, we're in the area of family, we're in the area of career and the foundations of the future. So something could be happening here that amounts to both an ending and a beginning. So if we look at Virgo, we've got that whole thing in reverse. So we've got the moon itself in the 10th house, and we've got the sun down there in the 4th house. And, I think this is really partly to do with the idea of, have you got the balance right between work life, career, and home life? And also in regard to what you want to achieve in the big world, the world of your ambitions, and what really matters to you in the sense of being at home or your private life. Now, there must be balance here. It can't be, too much on one side and not the other. And so getting that into balance is important. And often when we get our head around something like that and we decide, I need a better work-life balance, I need to really figure out, where I stand with what I want to achieve in life, and also what really matters to me in terms of my roots, my home, my family. I've got to get this balance right. And if we think about it, we can make some good decisions. But sometimes the cosmos does it for us, and guess what? We lose a job. We can't stay in that particular house anymore. We have an upset with members of the family, and something happens which marks an ending, and we don't always like the fact that we have to, create a new beginning without some of the aspects of things and that we had been very used to. So on to our next group, and here I'm going to come to Aries first of all. And for Aries, we're looking at this full moon in the 3rd house. And if you've got a chart, you've got Aries rising, then that means this full moon is cutting across your 3rd, 9th house. And this is a very interesting axis, and it has a lot to do with seeking. And of course, when we're learning something, we're educating ourselves, we're seeking knowledge, but we can seek all sorts of other things. We can seek the purpose of life. We can seek to find, all sorts of things in life. So this full moon is all about either the completion of a journey, and we can use that journey in quite literal senses. Maybe around this time you are making a journey and you'll be reaching the end of that journey at some point, and that journey in itself will be meaningful. Something will happen on that journey, or as you're sitting in your seat on an aeroplane for hours on end, you have time to think about things. So by the time you get to your destination, you've reached a few conclusions. There's all sorts of ways to make a journey, and that's what Aries, Aries rising 3rd and 9th axis is all about: journeys and the completion of journeys. It may also have to do with sort of framing our opinions about things as well, and how we make our opinions known when we're thinking about using social media, or we're talking to people, or writing about things, whatever it may be. I think we have to recognize when perhaps we need to change our opinions, and that some of those opinions are stale, they're done and dusted, and we need to get some new ones, because that's also that full moon for Aries in the 3rd house. Be careful of what you say, because it might be controversial, or it might be outdated. People think, that's old thinking. And what are we doing? We want to go forward. We want to have new thinking. With Libra, we've got the reverse in place. So we have the full moon in the 9th house. Now, this can say that there is important information or connections coming from overseas or from a distant place. people in distant places, so that information that you're receiving will set something in its right context. You'll say, oh, now I understand. Or, okay, that's done and dusted. I've done that. That project is finished. That idea is finished. It might also be things to do with your, I talked about this idea of seeking knowledge. It's a very good time to complete a course or to complete a phase of something that you've been doing that would loosely fit into the category of seeking. And sometimes, and this applies to Aries as well as to Libra, when you do have a full moon on this axis, and of course, Venus is turning retrograde on the 19th, travel can be an issue. Tend to be more people on the roads. There tend to be more dramas at points of departure, whether we're looking at airports and stations and all that kind of thing. And journeys just simply take longer. They might be more interesting, but they take longer. So especially for Aries and Libra, if you are going on a journey, give yourself a lot of time and take a lot of things just in case you're stuck somewhere or you need to get hold of people or entertain the children. Have it all ready to go. Now, when we come to Cancer and Capricorn, for Cancer, we're looking at the 12th house because Gemini is your preceding sign. Now, the 12th house is this real powerhouse of the horoscope. It's the area of the unconscious mind. It's where all sorts of things get formed, but they're formed in the deep sea of the unconscious. So there's a lot of things playing into that. Sense impressions, feelings, subtle signs and signals. So pay attention to your dreams, especially at the time of the full moon, because they might be full of information. And I think it's a very good plan when you have a 12th house transit of some sort, especially with a sun, or in this case, a full moon. There's this idea of writing down your dreams, because the phrases you will use will speak to you. They'll apply in another way. I remember once one of my friends had a dream, and in it somebody was telling her, you're going south, and at the time she was looking at a map and seeing that she was on a road south. But when she wrote it down, she realized that it meant something was going south. So she thought about that, figured out, where she could make an adjustment. So dreams are a wonderful way of getting insight into what our unconscious has picked up that we consciously aren't aware of. Now, it might have something to do with health as well, health of mind, body, and spirit. So particularly around the full moon, take it easy. Don't cram your schedule. And we're just before Christmas, aren't we? And we do tend to do a lot of things. If we're just doing a lot of shopping, doing a lot of, getting things together, we may be traveling, we may be talking to lots of people, parties or whatever. And it's easy to overstretch ourselves. So be very, very careful with your health and overdoing it, Cancer. And I want to say the same thing for Capricorn as well, because although, here we've got the moon in the 6th house, the sun is in the 12th house, and the same thing applies. This is not a time to really push yourself too hard. And I think we know when we're doing that, because it isn't just a question of using physical energy. It's often emotional energy and mental energy. And if we stress ourselves out this way, we're not the same people. And a lot of things can go wrong, whether we're talking about, we can, have an injury, we can get sick, or, we can, we can offend people when we're not completely well and, energetic. That's something to really watch out for. But I think too, for Capricorn in particular, we may be looking at some kind of changes in the workplace. And these might be female oriented because it's the moon in the 6th house. And it may also mean working from home. Or I suppose you could make your office a place like home. But we are sort of playing around with that theme of work and home. And also routines being changed, perhaps again because of different circumstances. And at the very least, we often do go home for Christmas. So that does involve new routines. So on to my last group. We are with a fixed sign. So I'm going to start with Aquarius. So Aquarius for you this full moon is taking place in the 5th house. And this is a very joyful area of the horoscope. We find pleasure in our 5th house, whether we have romance, we have music, art, all that kind of thing. Sport even comes into this area, believe it or not. I think, one day I'll talk a little bit more about the houses and we'll understand why there are all these disparate themes. But in a way, it's, that 5th house is ruled by Leo, the heart. So whatever makes our heart beat a little faster, and that can be good when you think of cardiovascular energy, and when you think about cardiovascular activity, and when you think also about your heart beating faster because romance is in the air. But it is also an area of creativity, and this axis with the 11th and the 5th house, that's both Aquarius and Leo, we're looking at the end of a gestation period. So something's been cooking for a while. Maybe it's been cooking in that time between June the 10th and December the 19th. That kind of period, something's been getting its act together. But it can be procreative. So we also look at the idea of bringing babies into the world or becoming a godparent or something happening to your offspring. And, whether that's something that's wonderful and makes you feel, well, of course, there's a time of carol concerts. And if you've got small children, what a magical time that is. So that full moon brings full volume sentimentality and romance and all of that right fully into the picture. It's a time to give birth, but we don't really necessarily mean giving birth to a little human being. We mean giving birth to ideas, things that are going to take us through for some more months further on. And the same really when we look at Leo as well, with that moon in the 11th house. This does draw you a little bit more into the collective world. So it's doing things as a team, working in groups, getting behind all sorts of things that involve humanity. And when you think about Christmas, and a very good plan to do this on this full moon, is the idea that other people, especially the homeless and people who are really suffering, they depend on volunteers and organizations who provide food and help. And this would be a really superb thing to place your energies in, Leo, around the time of this full moon. So to give humanity the benefit of your sunny spirit and your generosity. Last two, and we come to Taurus and Scorpio. So here we have the axis of self-worth and finance, because these two are interlinked. How we feel about ourselves is often how rich we feel, both in our person and the value we place on ourselves, as well as how much money we have in the bank. So for Taurus, with the with this full moon in the 2nd house, we're focusing really on your income and also your sense of self. And it is about what you provide for other people. So here we've got something coming to a sense of completion. So maybe it's a service you've been providing for people and it's at an end, you're done with it. Or does it mean, that people have taken advantage of you and they've not seen your true value and you've been doing all this stuff for them and it's time to say, no more, not doing that anymore. Self-value, just as important as the idea of completing a job, finishing a contract, the end of a source of income. And of course, even if all those things are true, what follows the end of a source of income, what follows the end of a financial cycle, is that you begin a new one. Now, when we look at Scorpio, which is still on this financial axis of worth, this is not so much about giving, but about receiving. And, a lot of us aren't very good at receiving, are we? Not always very good at saying thank you, or whether it's, we could say thank you for a gift, but let's say somebody is giving us a gift about how they feel about us. We can sometimes be very diffident about it and sort of say, oh no, that's not true, or whatever. But I think learning to accept, learning to receive, and of course, let's take this out into a bigger context and think about sexual exchange, which is the 8th house as well. Do we give or do we receive? Just as important to receive. So here, this full moon may mean the completion of a financial process, whether you've been looking to borrow money and you've had to go through all the various stages of that, whether it's an inheritance you're about to receive or some kind of settlement, redundancy settlement, divorce settlement, can mean all these things. So that's where, in fact, that focus is. But concentrate on the idea of receiving, because it is important to be able to receive as it is to give. Now, in point of fact, before I come to the very end of my video, I wanted to say one more thing about that retrograde Venus. When you think about Venus also having to do with the act of love, and what inspired me to talk about this was talking about it in relation to Moon in the 8th house, is the idea that often on a retrograde Venus, you're more prone to something like honeymoon disease. You know, you get those things that happen in regard to things to do with love. And so it puts you out of action for a while. And that was the last thing I really wanted to talk about in regard to Venus retrograde. So here I am, finally at the end. And my conclusion today was something that came to mind when I was listening to a talk by the Dalai Lama, which is, you know, the Dalai Lama is such an absolutely wonderful, amazing person, so modern in some ways, so easy to understand, but so wise, full of wisdom and a real sense of a cooked spirit, if you know what I mean. It isn't all flowery and happening out there. It's cooked. It's within his very being. And what he was saying, and of course, in a funny kind of way, I think I've sort of come around this subject a little bit in reference to the Saturn Uranus square. And that's the idea of our mindset making such a difference to our external circumstances. So if you have a good mindset, then challenging external circumstances don't overwhelm us. We have a mindset that looks at it differently, that can manage those difficult circumstances. If we have a mindset that isn't right, then even if things around us are wonderful, we've got lots of good things happening in our lives, we won't be happy. Mindset is crucial, and that may be something that you can certainly think about in terms of yourself and how much the way you look at a situation changes it and makes it easier to work with, or whether you look out at the lives of your friends and family who you may love dearly and you see very clearly that it's their mindset that is affecting them in terms of a situation which, if they shifted it just a little bit, they'd feel a lot happier. So thank you, everybody, for watching, and I look forward to speaking to you on my next video in a couple of weeks' time. Bye for now.